Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Michelle Cobb, Executive Director of the Podcast Academy, and I'm here with Tom Webster from Edison Research, who is going to talk to us today about podcast data from around the globe. He will be taking questions. Please put those in the Q&A box, not the chat box. All right, Tom, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to present a little bit of data here on some of the podcast data that we have from around the globe. We've done infinite dial research in 3 countries so far this year, and with a few more coming up. In fact, we just signed a deal, but have not announced it, to do another infinite dial study in a brand new country to us, but a very major English-speaking one surrounded by water. So that should be good. And so I've put a package together here that I like to call a tale of 3 countries, because I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we've seen in the first 3 infinite dial studies that we've done this year, which are the United States, Canada, and Australia, all English speaking, but we are going to have some other countries coming up. But I'm also going to look at some of our most recent share of ear data and a little bit of data from the Podcast Consumer Tracker, which is a subscription product that we have. It's not data that we typically publicly release, but I think it gives a really good sense of where the podcast listening audience is aggregating and where they're going. So I'm going to start with a little bit from our Infinite Dial research series. And I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with it. It's been in continuous service since 1998. It's the longest running study of consumer media habits in America. And it's also sampled and methodologically as bulletproof as we can possibly make it. We spend a great deal of money on the sampling for this. It's telephone sampling, mobile phone sampling, weighted and balanced so that it is in fact projectable and representative of the population in total that we are sampling, whatever country that is. And B, we do it the same way in every country, so that the results are in fact comparable, so that when we compare, as I'm going to show you in the first part of this presentation, podcasting data from the United States, Canada, and Australia, it really is apples to apples to apples, or whatever fruits they consume mostly in Australia. So I'm going to start off with sort of a level set, and that is that in all 3 of these countries, about 7 in 10 people listen to some form of online audio every month, and that certainly includes podcasting. It also includes the streams of radio stations. It includes things like Spotify, Pandora in America, but not in Australia and Canada. So all of that kind of folded together, it's about 7 in 10. And in fact, Australia and Canada are even a skosh ahead of the US in terms of overall online audio. And in terms of podcast listening, and I'm just going to focus here on monthly podcast listening, again, the 3 countries are fairly close, but there are radically different stories behind why that is between Australia and Canada. And that I thought I'd share with you today is something that just from a research perspective, I found audience, but it also, I think, gives you some insight on tracking audiences and tracking audience behavior and why it can differ so much from country to country. But certainly for now, about 4 in 10 Americans 18 plus have listened to a podcast in the last month, and that's 37% in Australia and 38% in Canada. And I'll start really by looking at America, because we have the longest running survey history there. We actually started researching podcasting in the Infinite Dial back in 2006, so about 15 years ago. But in the time that we have been tracking it, you'll see it's pretty much grown every year. It's grown linearly. It's grown steadily. It's never shot up enormously, although the past 4 years, I think, have been fairly robust growth. But it's been fairly steady. It hasn't sort of gone up like online video did in the early years or anything like that. But we're at a point now where about 116 million Americans have listened to a podcast in the last month. And if you're wondering and you're doing math in your head, as you know, I like to do in my spare time, the previous slide, you saw 40% for Americans. That was 18 plus, so that we could compare them across the 3 countries. In the US, we actually researched 12 plus, and that's why it's 41%, because the kids, they love the podcasts. And we've seen the most growth in podcasting in the US on the young end. And that's really been driven a lot by Spotify, frankly. Spotify as a single entity has had a lot to do with driving podcast listening in the very youngest kind of 12 to 34 demographics. In the United States, the story really is continuous, steady growth and a continuing broadening of the audience to be much more diverse. On the left, you see the total population in the US 12 plus. And on the right, you see monthly podcast consumers, and you'll see it's almost equal to the United States at this point. It did not used to be. Back when we first started tracking podcasting in the mid 2000s, it was about 2/3 male, very white male, very kind of 35 to 49 audience. But over time, we've seen the audience get much more diverse in terms of gender. We've seen them get much more diverse in terms of age. And in terms of share of age, the growth really is at the young end, as I mentioned, and at the older end. And I want to just point out how to read this graph a little bit. That middle bar of 35 to 54-year-olds, the composition of them in the podcast audience is shrinking, but the number of 35 to 54-year-olds listening to podcasts is growing. And that is the number in parentheses below each of those percentage figures. So 35 to 54, back in 2011, there were 12 million 35 to 54 listeners. Today, there are 34 million. So they've grown a lot, but we've seen even more accelerated growth on the very youngest end with 12 to 34-year-olds. And again, increased kind of distribution and promotion on the streaming services, like certainly Spotify has had a lot to do with that. And YouTube has had a lot to do with that, which I'll talk about here towards the end. And then even the older end, 55 plus, has grown in share. And a lot of that actually are from the earlier podcast listeners kind of aging into that demographic. So all of this is natural and good and reflective of the space getting a lot more diverse. And by the way, it's getting more diverse in terms of race and ethnicity as well. The podcast listening audience is more diverse now than the US population. As I mentioned in earlier days, and here we show 10 years ago, it was a lot whiter, but we've seen a lot of growth in certainly in sheer numbers with Black Americans and Hispanic Latino Americans. And in terms of share, Hispanic Latino Americans in particular have grown their share considerably. There is new research from last year on our website called the US Latino Podcast Listener Study, which is the first real deep dive into that audience. And we are continuing that this year. We're going to be releasing that, I think, within a month. So there'll be new data on the US Latino podcast listener. And we are going to have a brand new study on Black Americans who listen to podcasts. So that's going to be coming out very soon as well. So as we continue to flood you with data that I hope you enjoy. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, overall, the listening to podcasts is fairly comparable in the three countries that I'm going to talk about, US, Canada, and Australia. US is ahead by a little bit, 18 plus at 40%, but Canada and Australia are right behind. But there are interestingly different stories behind that seeming parity. And I'll start with just a quick look in Australia. Although Australian monthly podcast listening at 37% is nearly equal to what it is in the US, it grew a ton in the past year. It grew very sharply. And again, we sample these studies with the absolute gold standard. We spare no expense to get this right and to make it comparable country to country. So when we see something like this, it raises all of our eyebrows at Edison. The full Edison eyebrow was raised over this, but it was quintuple checked. And there was enormous growth in regular podcast listening in Australia year over year. And so that seeming parity with the US actually reflects quite a bit of catching up in the last 12 months. And I would point to two reasons for that. Number one, audio listening in general is continuing to grow pretty steadily in Australia in ways that it's kind of leveling out here in the US. In the US, the kind of overall online audio listening has kind of leveled out in the last 3 years. But you can see it's continuing to grow quite a bit in Australia. Now it's over 70%, but even back in 2018, it was just a little bit above 50. So it's grown fairly sharply over that period of time, which is the rising tide that I guess lifts all boats, as it were. And the second thing I would point to is there's been a lot more awareness of the term and about what the concept of podcasting is in Australia. And this is, I think, a real kind of takeaway for anyone looking at growing audience and growing share in podcasting, that just awareness of the concept matters, right? It is certainly a mainstream term in the United States. We're now up to 78% who are aware of the term podcasting. And again, 12 plus, the percentage who have listened in the last month is 41. So there's still quite a gap there of people who've heard the term, but have not necessarily tried one. But in Australia, there's been a tremendous surge in awareness of what podcasting is. And I still maintain there's really never been a kind of national advertising campaign or a national educational campaign for podcasting in the US, like there have been with, if you remember the Got Milk campaign, there's never really been a Got Podcasts campaign that the entire industry has gotten behind. And I think if that were to happen in the US, I think you'd see not just an increase in awareness, but that gap between people who are aware of podcasting and have actually listened to one would also close as people become aware that, okay, there's this great content out here. And now I know that I actually can listen to it on my phone. I've already got probably 4 apps on my phone that let me do that for free. And they may not know that now. And that's certainly some data that we've also collected over the years. So if in Australia, the story is parity with the United States because of a recent surge in growth due to increased awareness and increased online activity, Canada has a very different story. And if you recall, Canada was, again, close to the United States in terms of monthly podcast listening at 38%, but it hasn't grown a ton year over year. It's grown a percentage point each year since 2019. So if you sort of back up and look at the last 3 years here, Canada looks fairly flat. And there's a very good reason for that, which we did a little data detective work on to suss out. And a lot of that has to do, certainly in the current year, with the pandemic. And every country has been affected differently from the pandemic. They've had different lockdown rules. They've come into and out of lockdown at varying degrees. And Canada has been hit, I think, especially hard in terms of lockdown and the procedures in place to keep the population safe. And there's no better evidence of that than in looking at the percentage in the US and in Canada who have been in a car in the last month. Now, both the US and Canadian infinite dials were sampled in the first quarter of this year, so roughly at the same time. And one of the things that we track in the infinite dial is the percentage of people who either ride or drive in vehicles, so that we can then use that population to ask questions about in-car media usage and in-car podcast listening, which I'll get to. In much of the world, commuting went down, and that's just a natural occurrence that happened from the pandemic as more and more people worked from home, ceased business travel, ceased personal travel. And indeed, in the United States, you do see a little bit of a dip. The percentage of Americans 18 plus who have either driven or ridden in a car in the last month did dip a bit from 87% in 2020 to 83% this year. And that's certainly pandemic related. But as you can see, that number, it's fairly stable, right? It's generally in the high 80s. It doesn't change a whole lot. And that's really workforce related. But look at Canada. Canada had a huge drop. Canada dropped 15 percentage points from 92% last year to 77% this year. That's an enormous drop that you just don't see typically in an entire population like that. And again, Canada came into and out of lockdown very differentially from the United States. And we saw some differential behaviors as a result of that. So there was a big chunk of the population that were kind of taken off the road in Canada. And that chunk of the population had a particular bias, and that was a demographic bias. We've broken out the people who have in Canada who've driven or ridden in a car in the last month here into 3 age groups. And if you look at 18 to 34-year-olds, they went from 89% a year ago to 66% this year. That is a huge drop. And the biggest reason for that, at the peak of the pandemic, 50% of that population in Canada was unemployed. So the pandemic in Canada hit that demographic extremely hard, the 18 to 34-year-olds, in terms of employment and also in terms of riding and driving in cars. And as a result, because as I've already shown you, that young end is a huge component of the overall podcasting composition, you'll see that podcast listening in the car went down a lot in Canada. Last year, 27% of riders and drivers say that they listen to podcasts in the car. This year, that number dropped to 20%. If you are surprised to see a drop in anything related to podcasting, you now have an explanation for that. A huge chunk of very active podcast listeners were not behind the wheel. So podcasting in the car dropped from 27% who say they ever do it to 20. And even in the face of that, the monthly podcast percentage went up a little bit from 37 to 38. And so what I would submit is that what looks flat in Canada in terms of overall podcast consumption actually represents an enormous increase in podcast listening at home, because overall those numbers did not drop. They even went up a tiny bit, even though in-car listening to podcasts went down a significant amount. So behaviors changed. And it's the overall behaviors that I want to talk about next in terms of podcasting as podcasting relates to everything else in the world of audio. We produce a subscription study for agencies and media producers called Share of Ear. It comes out every quarter. It's a large scale quarterly survey project where we take an enormous sample. We take 4,000 persons per quarter, and they're asked to keep a one-day diary, either online or offline, of everything that they listen to. And they also tell us what brand it was, what device they used, where they were when they listened, and a whole bunch of other data in a very detailed diary. They're, of course, compensated to do this. And with that large sample, taking these daily diaries throughout the quarter, we're able to actually look at the overall share of ear, as we call it, I think an elegant term, which allows us to compare the percentage of time that people spend listening to podcasts compared to AM/FM radio or to audiobooks or to satellite radio here in the US. So we started this particular project back in 2014. And in 2014, AM/FM radio was the majority of our listening, just 7 years ago. The graph that I'm about to show you, if you've never seen one of our share of ear graphs, the percentages that you will see are percentages of time, not of humans. We listen to about 4 hours of audio every single day. And the percentages you'll see on this next graph is the percentage of that time that is devoted by Americans 13 plus to each of the various sources of audio that you will see. Now, this is 2014, back when we started this project, which again, we update every quarter. In 2014, AM/FM radio was 51% of all of our listening. And that's that big blue wedge on the left. And by the way, that includes AM/FM radio content that is on an actual AM/FM radio and the simulcast streams of AM/FM radio stations over the internet. But practically speaking, it's almost all AM/FM radio delivered, not actually internet delivered. So that was the majority, or at least just barely a majority at 51%. And when you go around the wheel here, or the donut, the delicious donut, as we like to call it, you'll see streaming audio, which is the pure play streaming audio sources like Spotify and Pandora, Apple, Google, etc. Owned music, which is, again, music you own. That could be physical music like CDs, cassettes, or vinyl. Could also be your own music files, Apple Music files, MP3s, etc. That was at 18% back in 2014. YouTube as an audio source, explicitly as an audio source, was 5% of our listening. Sirius XM here in the US at 7%. TV music channels, and that's not MTV, that's the sort of music only package that you often get at the end of the cable or satellite package you might have, but Music Choice is a big one here in the US. And then podcasts at 2%. And you might be tempted to look at that 2% and mentally add the word only to that, as in only 2%. But I can assure you that if it prints on this graph, it counts, it matters. It's an enormous amount of listening. And even at 2% in 2014, that represented tens of millions of hours every day of podcast listening. Because again, this is amongst all Americans, and most Americans don't listen to podcasts. So that's a lot of zeros averaged in. So the thing I want you to take away from this 2014 graph is the ratio of podcasting to AM/FM radio. AM/FM radio at 51%, podcasts at 2%. That's a 25-to-1 ratio. For every 25 hours of radio listened to, there was 1 hour of podcasts listened to. That was in 2014. This is today. Today, AM/FM radio is no longer the majority, but it didn't go away, right? It's still the plurality at 39%. And the large trends that you see here, you see a trend towards more streaming music. You see a trend away from your own music files. That's gone from 18% to 10% in 2021. So we listen to music that we quote unquote own a lot less and are much more likely to listen to music that we stream from sources like Spotify and Pandora. YouTube as an audio source has more than doubled. That's a significant part of podcast consumption. We know that. Satellite radio is a little bit higher than it was. And then podcasts are at 6%. And I called your attention to that ratio at the beginning of 25-to-1. Now it's more like 7-to-1, right? Or 6-to-1. It's really getting close. So that ratio of the time we spend listening to podcasts versus the amount of time that we as a country spend listening to AM/FM radio is much, much different than it was in 2021. It's changed a lot in just 7 short years. And a lot of that was happening before the pandemic. And indeed, some of the trends that we see in share of ear, some of them may have accelerated because of the pandemic and quarantine, but they weren't caused by it. And I think one of the biggest ones is the amount of time that we spend listening to music and to streaming audio and to all sources of audio at home. That's the thing that changed the most. In the past year, many of us, myself included, my home is behind me. Many of you are still working at home. And if you do work at home, and I'll show you this top graph here, if you are employed and you work from home, 72% of your audio comes at home, right? There's not as much in-car listening. If you are employed and do not work from home, that number is 29%. So there's a lot of in-car listening for that group that is continuing to commute and go to a workplace. And what we have seen throughout the pandemic, it's not that people changed their behavior where they were. So if you listened to a lot of, let's say, audiobooks at home, you continued to listen to a lot of audiobooks at home during the pandemic. So that at-home behavior didn't change a ton. The in-car behavior didn't change a ton. But what changed was, as I showed you with the Canadian data, the amount of time that we were in cars. And so that threw a lot of those ratios off. So what the biggest contributor to the overall acceleration towards more and more digital audio in the US, not the cause, but an accelerant, was spending more time at home. Because, as I will show you, at home, we listen to even more digital audio than we do in other sources. And here you see AM/FM radio actually shrinking to below a third at home. And you see streaming audio much higher, YouTube much higher, and podcasts at 7%. So that's starting to get close to 4-to-1, right? It's between 4 and 5-to-1, that ratio at home between podcasts and AM/FM radio. So that's the one thing that quarantine has really done. The behavior that it's changed the most has really gotten us more acclimated to listening to more digital audio, to have more time at home on our Wi-Fi networks or with our phones to listen to digital sources as opposed to in-car audio, which continues to be dominated by AM/FM radio. And I'm going to close here today before I take some questions with a couple of pieces of data from our podcast consumer tracking report. The podcast consumer tracking report is the only comprehensive measure of the entire audience, of the reach of every podcasting network, and really looks at the behavior from the audience up as opposed to download rankers. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of the download rankers out there. And they're important certainly for transactional things like ad impressions and things like that. Download rankers that you have seen have sort of 3 holes that we correct with the podcast consumer tracking report, which gives you a different look. First of all, the download rankers you have seen don't include all companies, right? There's certainly some major holes in all of them. Number two, they don't measure reach. They measure downloads, but they can't measure reach. And by what I mean by reach is the percentage of humans in the country that have listened to content from a given network or even a given show. If I listen to The Daily from the New York Times, for instance, Monday while I'm walking, Tuesday in the car, Wednesday here at my desk, I'm 3 different people to a download tracker. There's no way around that. And then the third thing that the traditional kind of download charts miss is a giant portion of listening, which happens on Spotify, that's not folded in, and a giant portion of listening that happens on YouTube that's completely undiscovered country. So we attempt to measure all of that. And everything is, of course, a verified podcast. It has to be available as a podcast for us to track it. But with the tracking report, it allows us, again, in a similar fashion to share of ear, to take a very large sample. Our sample that I'm going to show you here is over 8,000 people. And basically, we ask them what podcasts they listen to. They write that in their own words. We code that back to the actual names of the shows, the actual networks that produce them, and come up with an overall measure of the reach of the various networks in America, whether they are clients or not, and also the reach of the largest shows. One of the other things that we track, though, is where people get their podcasts. And this is something that I want to leave you with because it's one of the most important things to think about as a podcaster in the coming years. Apple used to dominate the podcast space, and we indeed continue to look a lot at the Apple podcast charts, but that does not represent the majority of the universe. And in fact, that percentage of the universe is shrinking as other platforms are increasing their share. And one of the questions that we ask in the Podcast Consumer Tracker is, what platform or service do you use most often to get your podcasts? And today, 23% say Apple iOS. The iOS podcasts app is where they get their podcasts most often. But 22%, nearly tied, say Spotify. And another 18% say YouTube. And again, any podcast that is cited or named by our sample in the Podcast Consumer Tracker, we verify to make sure that it is, in fact, a podcast. But most podcasts are also available on YouTube. Most leading podcasts are. And there's enormous amounts of listening to podcasts, whether that's, and not just the Joe Rogan show, it's plenty of other shows. Pod Save America, for instance, very active YouTube audience. And they are finding it in YouTube. It's easy to find podcasts in YouTube, putting it on to listen to, and then switching to another tab or putting their phone away. So it's an enormous source of podcast consumption. Now that's the individual platforms, the iOS podcast platform, Spotify, and YouTube. In this question, which platform or service do you use most often? If we fold in the desktop podcasts app for Apple, and we also fold in Google Podcasts, which is their mobile app, then you put all that together. And Apple does continue to lead here. If you add the iOS and macOS podcast app together, that's 27% of people say it's the platform they use most often. That's not percentage of podcasts. It's the percentage of people who say that's the platform they use most. Spotify, it stays at 22. And then YouTube plus Google Podcasts really tied with Spotify. And so those 2/3 of this chart here, the bottom 2/3, Spotify and YouTube and Google Podcasts, is an entire universe that the kind of existing download ranker methodologies kind of miss, and that I think are not given enough mental shelf space by podcasters in terms of committing and going all in to having a strategy and a plan to succeed differentially on each of these services, because the strategies you use are going to be different for each of these services. And the last stat that I will leave you with here, these last 2 charts have been the platform or service used most often. We also ask, which ones do you ever use? And you can select more than one, right? I myself use 3 or 4 different sources. You may as well. So when we ask people to select all the services that they use to ever listen to podcasts, guess what's on top? It's YouTube. And this continues to shock people. Again, everything that we talk about here is a verified podcast. But if you think about what YouTube is the greatest content search engine, right? We talk about discovery issues in podcasting. It's really easy to find things on YouTube. It has a great search engine. It's the best podcast search engine, frankly. It's also a universal service. You don't need to subscribe to it like you do to Spotify, or need an email account or anything like that. If I want you to listen to a podcast and I give you and I tell you to find it on YouTube, I know you're going to be able to do it regardless of what phone you have or what other streaming services that you subscribe to. So YouTube is a great place to share content and to find content and to get recommended content. If you have ever watched one YouTube video that you intended to watch and then watched between 2 and 100 more that you did not intend to watch because YouTube fed them to you, YouTube is really good at that. So all of that means that when you look at all of these shows, and this is our most recent top 50 shows that includes the entire universe, right? Some of these shows are really driven by Apple heavy audiences. Some of them are driven a little bit more by Spotify. Some of them are driven a little bit more by YouTube. But they're out there on all of these platforms and committing to these platforms to be everywhere that the audience is, because that's what you need to do today to survive. You can't just think of your show as a podcast. You have to think of your show as a show. And some elements of your show are going to be a podcast that it's delivered by RSS to a podcatcher. But if you really want to maximize your potential, you're going to be everywhere the listeners are. And I think back in 2011, we used to think of our audience like this, that our goal was to sort of shepherd them into iTunes to subscribe to us. But our audience are not sheep, and we're not in control of them. We've never been in control of them. The audience are not sheep. They are feral hogs. They're rampaging everywhere through every possible platform and service, encountering content, not necessarily seeking out podcasts intentionally, but they're finding it. They're finding it on Facebook. They're finding them on Instagram. They're finding them on YouTube. They're finding them on SoundCloud, all these places that maybe we don't think of or commit to as podcasters, but that's where audience can be found. And in order to be truly as successful as we could be, we need to take into account the fact that podcasts aren't just that RSS delivered thing that goes into our Apple Podcast app anymore. They're audio shows, and they're audio shows that can be consumed anywhere and everywhere. And to really win, we have to be anywhere and everywhere, and not just platform specific. So that's, I think, a major takeaway for everybody. And I mentioned Facebook here. One of the things that we've tracked in our infinite dial research is that in general, Americans are starting to leave Facebook a little bit. Usage is declining. And when you ask people, what's the service that you use the most? What social media service do you use the most? Today, about 47% of social media users say Facebook is, and it's no longer the majority. It used to be. With existing podcast listeners, only 36% say Facebook. So podcast listeners today have really gone to Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. But look at that audience of people who have never listened to a podcast, that new undiscovered country of people that could be listeners to you. 60% of them use Facebook most often. I continue to believe that Facebook is a tremendous platform to get your podcasts discovered, at least sampled and heard by a potentially receptive audience that has never heard, maybe never even heard of podcasting, but could certainly listen to something that is in their stream, plays in the background while they're doing other things. And that's how podcasting is really going to reach its potential, is by kind of breaking out of its boxes, by all of us doing the work. I'll close by saying I have a weekly newsletter I would love your subscriptions to. It's free. You can find it at tomwebster.media, or the Unsayable on a Podcast, I Hear Things. Thank you to South Georgia and the Sandwich Islands for the .gs domain. And I also produce that as a podcast, I Hear Things, which is available everywhere I said it would be, because I have to do those things. And I'll stop here and hand things back over to Michelle and take any questions you might have. And otherwise, thank you for the gift of your time and attention.
The first question we have is that you mentioned an upcoming study on Black podcast listeners.
Yep.
When will that be released?
Don't have a date on it, but it is active in the company right now. So I don't have a date on that yet, but it will come out. I can't say it's going to come out the first half of the year because that's rapidly coming to a close, but I wouldn't expect it much beyond that. The second edition of the U.S. Latino podcast listener study will come out first.
Okay. Another question. Is there any data on people who listen to podcasts on YouTube? And if they also listen to podcasts on other podcast listening platforms? So can we convert YouTube listeners to a more traditional podcast realm?
First thing I will say is that we have an enormous amount of data on that, and including some new data that we're going to share at Podcast Movement. Podcast Movement just announced their keynotes, and we'll be once again giving the kind of opening research keynote, and we're going to be talking a lot about that. The second part of that question, I would challenge, and I would challenge you not to think about, can you convert them to somewhere else? Because again, that's not how humans operate. And if your success depends on taking people from YouTube, getting them off of YouTube and listening to your show in a podcast app, you've just doubled your workload, my friend. What I would suggest is that you find them where they encounter you, and then fully inhabit that platform. Figure that out for yourself. Okay, so now I need to be on YouTube. Now I need to be a successful YouTuber, right? And you might say that that's more than you want to sort of tackle. Maybe that's biting off more than you can chew. I completely understand that. I don't actually put my stuff on SoundCloud for a couple of reasons, and okay, that's my loss. I do have my podcasts on YouTube though. But that is the work that you could do. And anytime that someone asks me, how can I grow my podcast? How can I grow my audience? I can just tick through a lot of these sort of hygiene level things. Well, are you on YouTube? What do you do on YouTube? Are you on Facebook? What are you doing on Facebook? Those are kind of hygiene level things. And if you're not doing at a minimum those things, then there's some low hanging fruit, I think.
Great point. All right. Apple Podcasts and categories. Do all countries have the same number of choices? So in this case, the questioner says the podcast does better in Japan than in the US. Yeah.
So the category structure, I'm not sure if the category structure is the same in other countries as it is in the US. I assume that it is. We track a couple of things in the Podcast Consumer Tracker. First, all of the podcasts that people name and write in, and every quarter we go through about 10,000 of these. We match them up with the Apple API to their category, and that's at least the category that the producer intended it to be in Apple, which is a restrictive environment. It's not as many categories as we would like. We also ask a much more detailed topics of interest question that is about double that number of categories. And the sort of country to country specifics of things is, I think, compounded by smaller sample sizes in those countries. And I showed you the data for Canada, Australia, and the US. You can throw Sweden and potentially the UK in there. They're all going to be at about that same level. But if you go to some non-English speaking and even some very advanced, first world non-English speaking countries, those percentages are much, much lower. And so you are dealing with smaller sample sizes. We did an infinite dial in Germany, for instance, and that they were far behind the US in terms of podcast consumption. In our last infinite dial, we do need to update that. So I don't think that there are differences in the taxonomy from country to country. I could be wrong about that. I see Ivo Terra in the audience. He'll probably know.
Ivo, tell us in the chat.
Yeah. Tell me what I don't know, Ivo, which is enormous.
All right. And he confirms same categories.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Boy, it would be it would make the Tower of Babel look like a stick to do anything else, I think, if you're Apple.
Fantastic. All right, I'll give people one last chance to ask Tom any questions. And I will tell you all that we have a number of upcoming events. Next Friday, we have a Lunch and Learn. We're going to be talking a little bit about monetization, and we'll be with the State of Women Podcast Network. And then we have an Adobe audition course coming up. We've got the member meeting, and early next month, we'll be talking to James Cridland from Pod News. So do register for those events, and we will be recording a number of them so that they are in our library as well. All right, looks like no more questions for you, Tom. You've told us everything we need to know, and so you are off the hook. Thank you so
My,
much for your time today.
my work here is done.
All
Thank you.
right. Everybody have a great afternoon, and we will see you soon.